The strangest thing has happened. I know I said I would update my travel log regularly, but wireless and cellular service has been even more sparse than I imagined in Romania. Plus, everything I had planned to say hardly matters anymore. I feel like I'm waking from a month-long hallucination. I'm not sure what to say. I'm not even sure where to start. The first several days passed by without anything spectacular, as my little twin-prop engine plane landed in Albach, located within the Ares Valley of rural Romania. I would have said I saw some spectacular sights, met some people worth mentioning, but nothing like that seems to matter anymore. Not with what happened on the fifth day. It was a bleak, rainy afternoon when I finally arrived in Prundu, the small remote village where I would be spending the next week and a half. Mountains raced to the sky, encompassing the valley floor, a heavy mist permanently suffocating daylight from view as it ate away at the distant scenery. The innkeeper, Arthur, was actually the first man I met upon arriving. I didn't even realize it was him at the time, however, as I only watched his frantic silhouette dart past me in the driving rain. When I did finally arrive at the inn, however, I was immediately greeted by his two young children, Augustine and Benjamin. They must have been no more than 12, and yet it quickly became clear that they were running the small inn by themselves in their father's absence. I asked them where he might have run off to, but they assured me that I didn't need to worry and that he would be back by the end of the week. I don't think they intentionally lied to me by saying that. I think they truly expected him to return. Many days later, however, my week of hiking and sightseeing had ended, and although Monday rolled around like clockwork, Arthur was nowhere to be found. In all honesty, his continued absence completely slipped my mind until another 2 days passed and I approached the front desk again to inquire as to possible locations where my phone could get a signal. No one greeted me. It wasn't until I peered over the counter that I found Augustine slumped behind it. She looked to be asleep, paperwork and cleaning supplies scattered around her feet like dead insects. A notebook was pressed to the table by her spindly arms, under her bowed head. It looked like it detailed the guests, payment info, room condition, and things of the like. I cautiously moved my hand to wake her up, only to have her head snap upwards with a panicked flail seconds before I made contact. Her colorless irises were encircled by dark rings of filth and sleep deprivation. Her wispy gray hair almost appeared like it was flaking from her scalp. She quickly adjusted herself, blinking heavily several times before greeting me. After doing so, she almost immediately seemed to begin fading out of consciousness again. I returned the greeting, but quickly inquired as to Arthur's location and asked if she was still running the place by herself.
It is just me.
She replied as if half asleep.
I don't know where Father is. I will keep the inn operating in his absence.
Right, I replied, worry knitting my brows. You said that when I first arrived, but you also said he would be back by now. Do you know why he hasn't returned?
It is just me.
She slowly reiterated, dark, bleached irises staring past me.
I do not know where he is. I will keep the inn operating in his absence.
And Benjamin, I continued, pressing forwards in concern. He's with you too, right? Does he know anything? What can I do to help you? Augustine's dreary lids began to slip closed again, her hideously pale limbs fighting to keep her upright as she slowly shook her head.
I do not know where he is. I will keep the inn operating in his absence.
What? I fretfully replied, concern growing faster than I could contain it. What do you mean? Where did he go?
I do not know.
She whispered softly to the floor as her neck grew unable to support her head and her forehead pressed against the table. The notebook dropped to the floor with a soft clatter. I quickly darted around the counter and tried to wake her up again before she fell off her chair. Despite lightly shaking her this time, however, her heavy lids only managed to flutter lightly. Her tiny form was utterly unresponsive, going further limp after my attempted waking. Rain continued to drive down outside in torrents, the little dirt streets akin to rivers as debris swept past in the floods. No one was anywhere in sight. Now holding the little girl in my arms, I searched around momentarily before my gaze fell on the notebook by my feet. Without a second thought, I stooped down and picked it up, rifling through the pages to find a vacant room. I thought if I could just find one, I could grab the key and let the girl rest in there for a bit while I took over as manager, doing what little I could to keep the inn from completely shutting down. To my surprise, however, all but 2 of the rooms were vacant. I quickly brushed this off, knowing full well I was as far away as possible from tourist season, if there even was one to begin with in such a remote place. Locating the number of a suitable room and finding the matching key after some searching, I adjusted my grip on the girl, finding her terrifyingly light in my arms. I wiggled the coat from my shoulders before placing it over her and setting out into the rain. I reached the room in no time, both the key and lock so rusted and worn that it took me several tries to finally wrench the door open. Immediately after stepping inside, Augustine began to stir, panicked eyes darting behind closed eyelids. A sudden thrash of her tiny wrist nearly spun her to the floor, but I was able to catch her. By the time I set her down on the bed, she had again stopped moving. I watched her faint breaths curl out from pale, cold lips, her chest rising and falling in weak, rhythmic motions. I stayed for another several minutes, finally getting it in my head to write her a note explaining things to her for when she awoke. Finding no paper in the room, I grabbed a few squares of toilet paper and pulled a pen from my pocket. "Dear Augustine," I wrote, having to be cautious not to tear the flimsy material. "You really needed to rest. I put you in a vacant room and I'll return the key to the front desk for when you wake up. I will try to ask around for your father and brother and do what I can to keep up the inn. Please rest. With regards, John Matthews." I clicked the pen closed and gingerly placed the note by her side, now afraid I might wake her. I tiptoed out of the room, quietly pressing the door shut and locking it before slipping the key into my pocket. Realizing I had left my coat with her, I sighed heavily before making a run for it back to the front desk. Upon sitting back down, my gaze again became entangled with the guest's notebook. I picked it up and scanned through the 2 occupants. One was obviously me, the date of arrival a little over a week ago, scheduled to leave tomorrow. Upon inspecting the other guest more carefully, however, my eyes narrowed. Their arrival date was over a year ago. There was no scheduled end date. Bringing the book closer to my face, I thumbed through the pages, trying to determine if a mistake had been made. There was no mistake. The room 5, hadn't been used by any other residents in over a year, always listed as occupied. Countless others had come and gone through the various rooms, but it was as if someone was living permanently in room 5. Feeling a light twinge of hope, I rapidly convinced myself that this person, whoever they were, must have been in good relation to the inn owners, Arthur specifically. They must have had some information to help. Sliding the book under the desk for safekeeping, I hurriedly set out to room 5. My knocks were admittedly far too light to produce a response as I nervously rapped at the heavy wood. Nothing came from inside. Taking a big breath and reminding myself that it was to help these 2 children, I knocked again, far harder. I figured I would willingly accept the consequences if I was accidentally waking the occupant up. Silence greeted me. Only the rain returned my knocks, pelting against the ground behind me. "Hello?" I called out, knocking again as hard as I could. "Please, I could use some help." Nothing. I furrowed my brow. They must have been out. I would have to wait for them to return. It was a late afternoon already. They would likely return at any hour. The guest notebook hadn't listed any special circumstances. It was all normal cleaning schedule, normal routine. They would be back for sure. I watched the ghastly pale sun fade into oblivion behind the surrounding mountains as the evening finally drew to a close. I tapped my hand at the desk I sat at, my anxiety growing with every passing hour. The resident still had not returned. But not only that, Augustine had yet to wake up. I had checked on her again later that evening, seeing her pale form still lying atop the bed, breathing softly. It had been nearly 10 hours now, though. I was certain sleeping for that long wasn't an issue. By the looks of it, she needed at least that, if not far more. And yet, her continued slumber did nothing but fill me with dread. She was breathing fine, but the way she looked, the way she had fallen unconscious mid-sentence and had to be carried there, I would have been crazy not to worry. By the time midnight rolled around and the other guest had still yet to return, I could no longer calm myself down. I grabbed room key number 5 and set off towards it, unsure of what I was even hoping to accomplish. Maybe I expected to find Arthur's phone number somewhere in the room. Maybe I expected a clue of some sort to help me piece things together. Hell, I couldn't help but half hope Arthur would just be sitting inside waiting for me. I found none of those things. I knocked on the door again several times, figuring the occupant may have somehow slipped past me without my knowledge sometime during the night. But still, nothing but silence emanated from the space. Feeling rain run down my sopping hair as the night sky sparked with distant thunderstorms, I placed the key in the lock and turned it. The door swung open like the rock slab of a sarcophagus, so heavy and ancient I felt my skin prickle with unease. It wasn't a second later that my fears were realized, the hideous odor of decay and rot screaming from around the door to make my stomach convulse. The inside air was thick with decomposition, almost as if beads of flesh and blood were trapped in the air itself. After swinging the door open and staggering back from the sheer putrid stench, I could immediately make out 2 bodies lying atop the bed. Their mangled forms were dark and silhouetted, but I could immediately tell that they were the source of the stench. Flesh lay in composted heaps around them, one considerably more decayed than the other, howling jaw outstretched in a horrific scream as tendons and muscle turned to puddles of rot. The mattress was soaked to the core, turned a rusted brown with blood and decay. My heart squirmed into my throat, tinting my saliva red as I covered my mouth and took another step back. The sight was horrific and gruesome, the bodies remaining in my vision like branded patterns on my eyelids. And yet, the scene itself wasn't what shook me to my core. It should have been stagnant, the room utterly motionless as these two corpses fell apart in the darkness. But it wasn't. No, there was slight, but utterly unmistakable movement, rising and falling like partially deflated balloons. The corpses were breathing. The door suddenly slammed shut, vile gray eyes flashing into view as a ghastly form stepped between the room and I. I pinwheeled backwards, Benjamin's sudden appearance the jump scare my heart had been unsuccessfully bracing for.
Do not!
He hissed, hand rushing forward to grab the key from me. I jerked further backwards instinctively, my mouth letting forth a rush of incoherent words as he wrenched the key from my grasp.
Stay away,
he nodded, putting out his hand and locking the door. What the hell is in there? I cried in panic. What was that?
Where is Augustine?
He just asked urgently.
She's very sick.
Room 2. I stammered, swallowing hard, still trying to stomach what I had just seen. She's asleep. Benjamin's eyes corroded into horror, his lanky form instantly demanding the key from me. Further disturbed by his sudden panic, I fumbled around for the key in my pocket, not even getting it halfway out before he snatched it from me and took off running towards the room. I followed in a state of terrified disbelief, stumbling into the room behind him as he threw the door open. Augustine was just as she had always been, lying stagnant and dead, aside from the soft breaths that slithered out from pale lips. I stammered as I watched Benjamin just stand motionlessly and stare at her. She didn't know where you were. She said she was keeping up the inn alone. Where did you go? He completely ignored me, stooping down beside Augustine and softly grasping her pale hand. After several minutes of silence, however, he finally spoke up.
I went to get help for her.
His words were cold and heavy, seeping through the air like sludge.
Just as my father had tried to do.
He turned her arm around slowly, flinching as her skin suddenly split like rotten fruit, muscles and fat rupturing out with a hideous squelch. He dropped her instantly, further panic spreading through his ghastly face as he took a step back and quickly addressed me.
We're going,
he said. I was paralyzed with unbridled terror and confusion as I watched Augustine's now sopping arm slap back against the bed with a hideous slosh. The sheets instantly began to sully with blood and filth.
The dead here do not die,
Benjamin urged in panic, trying to push me out of the room.
but it is not what it seems.
I noticed that the blood didn't rush from Augustine's arm in rhythmic pulses as if being forced out by her heart. No, it just slowly seeped out like from a burst water balloon. She had no pulse. And yet she was breathing. I staggered back into the cold, dark rain as Benjamin gave me one last shove. He slammed the door behind us, locking it frantically. Hospital, was all I could croak out. The image of her torn flesh burned into my vision. We need to... hospital. Benjamin shook his head.
There is nothing to be done.
What are you saying? I fought back in hysteria. She's clearly alive. We have to do something.
The 2 occupants of room 5.
Benjamin spoke slowly, still shaking his head as he met my gaze.
Have been dead for over a year.
His eyes narrowed as he continued.
They do not eat, do not move, do not have a pulse. and yet they never stop breathing.
I swallowed hard. I was crazy, wasn't I? Such a statement should have been laughable, so absurd I should have immediately dismissed it. And yet, it did nothing but fill me with dread. He told me that no one knew what caused this condition, this state of suspended animation. He revealed that his father had become obsessed with the phenomena after the two occupants slipped into it a little over a year ago. Since then, he had traveled all over Romania, searching for similar cases while keeping the two occupants sealed away. Apparently, the doctor had only found one other case in which a deceased individual displayed similar symptoms. The man had been killed by a truck on a back road just outside Jitsu. Although nearly cut in half by the truck, the man's corpse continued to breathe regularly as it lay in the road for several hours. After being moved to a morgue that same night, it was reportedly cremated instantly. The trail seemingly ended there. When I asked Benjamin if his father had discovered anything, he said something that still haunts me. His father had begun to formulate a hypothesis that the phenomena was caused by a person losing their soul. It was a downright chilling thought, but it only got worse from there. When I asked Benjamin why he had been so adamant about me leaving the room with Augustine in it, why his father had always kept the door to room 5 locked, he said that his father's research was strange, but based in science as much as possible. For something to supposedly never eat, yet never completely fall into decomposition, somehow keep breathing. It wasn't possible. The corpses had to have been drawing energy from somewhere. That meant that anything living and in close proximity was in danger. Until they could figure out how the phenomena worked, they couldn't take risks. The second reason was even more chilling. There was a high chance that the condition was contagious. Arthur had begun to hypothesize this when he first began noticing symptoms in Augustine. She would stop sleeping at night, horrible insomnia rendering her incapable of closing her eyes for weeks at a time. When she did finally slip into a state of unconsciousness, it would always be during the day, and her heart would stop, only resuming again once she awoke several hours later. Becoming absolutely panic-stricken by this, Arthur had set out to reinvestigate the incident with the severed man and the truck, frantically checking for missing details and clues. He had promised to find a cure. This was the trip he never returned from. I'm telling you this now, picking up my vlog, because Arthur was wrong. This is not based in science. There is no cure. Something is happening here, something I can't explain. I don't think anyone possibly could. All I know is that it is evil. What Benjamin had gone to retrieve when I found Augustine alone, what he in his desperation thought might have helped, was a cross. I'm telling you this now because Benjamin was wrong. He said they never move, and yet when I put that cross in Augustine's room, I swear to God that thing flinched. And the next morning I opened the door to that room, and her corpse was gone. It had changed rooms. I'm telling you this now because I don't think I'll be making it back. I'm telling you this now because I got too curious, tried to pick up Arthur's work, tried to explain something that didn't want to be found out. I'm telling you this now because I put crosses in every room except for one. Wanted to catch them moving in the act. But the room I chose to not put crosses in was my own. And although I'm waiting outside in the dead of night, looking into the room through my back window, I hear shuffling behind me. These things are not dead, nor are they living, but they've been using the windows to get in and out, only pretending to be dead. I no longer know how much of the blood in the rooms was theirs, and how much of it was their victims. Don't trust them for a second, don't ever turn your back. I'm just frantically hoping this message sends, hope someone will hear that. Please, heed warning. They won't stay in Romania. Evil is brewing in this world. Burn the dead. Stay far away from symptoms, and it